The twilight before the fall. When an empire begins to die, its walls don't crumble first, its faith does. From the Diary of an Ottoman Soldier, 1912. Autumn, 1911. The sun was sinking behind the Bosphorus, staining the waters crimson like spilled blood. The great dome of Hagia Sophia caught the dying light, glimmering faintly, a ghost of its former glory. Constantinople, once the beating heart of the world, now breathed in quiet dread. The Ottoman Empire, that sprawling realm that had once stretched across 3 continents, was rotting from within. It had ruled for 6 centuries, but the cracks were now visible to anyone who dared to look.
In a silent chamber of the Topkapi Palace, Sultan Mehmed V Rashad sat in contemplation. He was frail, his eyes tired, his spirit dimmed. By his side stood Halim Pasha, the royal advisor.
"Your Majesty," Halim whispered, "the Balkans are burning."
Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, Montenegro, they are uniting against us. The Sultan's voice trembled.
"We have soldiers, and we have faith."
"Yes," Halim replied. "Soldiers we have. Faith, I am not so sure." The Sultan's words echoed in the hollow corridors of power. The empire was not only threatened by foreign armies, it was being eaten alive by its own divisions. A new generation called the Young Turks had risen from within the military, modernists who despised the old religious aristocracy. Their charismatic yet ruthless leader, Enver Pasha, dreamed of reshaping the empire into a modern Turkish nation. But his ambition was both his gift and his curse. Among his shadowy allies was a man few today remember, Ibrahim Haji Demir, a brilliant strategist and secret informant. According to declassified British records, Demir was among the first to warn that the coming Balkan conflict would not just redraw borders, it would end an empire. Meanwhile, Europe was watching and waiting. Russia sought to liberate the Slavic Christians under Ottoman rule. Britain eyed the empire's trade routes with quiet greed. France focused on its colonies but secretly funded anti-Ottoman uprisings. Everyone knew. The fall of the Ottomans meant the birth of a new Europe. In a secret meeting in Sofia, Russian envoy Nikolai Petrovich leaned close to the Bulgarian general and whispered,
"The Ottoman clock is ticking. We only need to give it a little push."
That push would soon ignite what history remembers as the Balkan Wars. In January 1912, Ibrahim Haji Demir wrote a private letter to a friend in Thessaloniki. "I see the bones of an empire shaking. Politics blind, soldiers weary, faith for sale. Soon there will be a war, not of land but of identity. And when it ends, we will no longer recognize ourselves." That letter, later found in the British National Archives, became one of the eeriest predictions of the empire's fate. In a small Albanian village, a young farmer disappeared one night. Days later, word spread. He had joined a Bulgarian rebel band. A trivial rumor, perhaps. But when it reached Istanbul, it caused panic. Because everyone in the capital knew. When an Albanian takes up arms, the empire has begun to fracture. One cold evening, inside a dimly lit room in Istanbul, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and a few senior officers gathered around a wooden table. They all knew war was coming. The question was, when? Enver Pasha poured water into his glass. "If we don't strike first, they will. And when they do, we'll lose not just land, we'll lose our history." Talat frowned. "The people are tired, the treasury empty, and our soldiers restless." Enver's eyes hardened. "Then perhaps history is not tired. Perhaps it demands our blood." That night, the decision was made. The Ottoman army would mobilize for war. No one realized they had just signed the empire's death warrant. In March 1912, the Ottoman warship Hamidiyya vanished in the Mediterranean. The official report claimed it sank in a storm, But decades later, an Italian researcher unearthed documents suggesting otherwise, that British agents had seized the ship, sabotaging the Ottoman navy before the war even began. If true, it would mean the Balkan Wars started not on the battlefield, but in the shadows of espionage. The wind grew colder over the Bosphorus. Ibrahim Haji Demir stood atop the Galata Tower, staring at the city below, the flickering lights of an empire about to enter darkness. "It has begun," he whispered. "Only time will tell how much blood it will cost." Far away, a faint gunshot echoed through the night. No one knew if it was a drill or the first cry of a dying empire.
Spring 1912. The Balkans were a volcano waiting to erupt. For years, the Ottoman Empire had been called the sick man of Europe. Now its neighbors, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, decided it was time to finish the patient off. In the Orthodox monasteries of Sofia, secret meetings were held. In dusty cafes of Belgrade, maps of Macedonia were spread across wooden tables. In Athens, Greek officers whispered, "When Constantinople falls, we will take back Byzantium." The Balkan states, rivals for centuries, had now formed an unlikely alliance, the Balkan League. Behind their unity stood one silent power, Russia. A Russian diplomat was overheard saying in Vienna, "The Ottomans are like a dying tree. We only need to shake it, and the fruit, Macedonia, Thrace, Albania, will fall into our hands." Meanwhile, Istanbul was trembling. Rumors spread faster than fire, of uprisings in Macedonia, of Greek warships moving toward the Aegean, of deserters vanishing into the countryside. Inside the War Ministry, Enver Pasha stood over a massive map. Red pins covered almost every frontier. Talat Pasha entered, his face pale. "They've declared mobilization in Sofia," Talat said. "Then so do we," Enver replied coldly. "Send the order." "We march." But deep inside, both men knew the truth. The Ottoman army was not ready. Half the rifles were rusted, uniforms were mismatched, ammunition was short. Many soldiers hadn't been paid in months. Worse, some divisions were loyal not to the Sultan, but to different political factions inside the army. The empire was preparing for a war it could not afford, with soldiers it could not trust. On the night of October 6, 1912, a coded telegram left the Ottoman Foreign Ministry for London. It read, "The Balkan states are preparing coordinated attack within 10 days. Request immediate assistance as per maritime treaty." The message never reached London. British archives would later reveal that the telegram was intercepted, not by the enemy, but by an Ottoman officer secretly working for the Young Turks. Why? Because Enver Pasha and his faction did not want British interference. They wanted the war, to prove themselves as saviors of the nation. This single act of betrayal silenced the last chance for diplomatic peace. October 8, 1912, Montenegro fired the first bullet. Within days, Serbia, Greece, and Bulgaria followed. The Balkan Wars had begun. Ottoman border forts collapsed one after another. In the misty plains near Thrace, a young Ottoman lieutenant wrote in his journal, "We march toward Lüleburgaz. The land trembles beneath our boots, but I feel no glory, only the weight of ghosts." The Battle of Lüleburgaz was one of the largest of the war, and one of the bloodiest. For 4 days, artillery thundered like unending storms. Mud mixed with blood, and corpses carpeted the earth. The Ottoman command system broke down. Communications were cut. Entire battalions fled in panic. When the smoke cleared, over 22,000 Ottoman soldiers lay dead or missing. Enver Pasha called it a tactical withdrawal. History calls it what it truly was, a massacre. Amid the chaos, Ibrahim Haji Demir, now working as an intelligence officer, stumbled upon something terrifying. In a captured Bulgarian encampment near Edirne, his team found documents written in Russian cipher. After days of decoding, the message became clear. Russia had funded and armed the Balkan League months before the war began. The uprising had been orchestrated. Demir rushed back to Istanbul with the documents, but by the time he reached the capital, his superiors were gone, arrested, exiled, or executed under orders from the Young Turks. The documents vanished. Ibrahim disappeared the next day. Some say he was killed by Ottoman secret police. Others claim he defected to Vienna with the evidence. His fate remains one of the many unsolved mysteries of the Balkan Wars. By March 1913, Edirne, the empire's second capital, the jewel of Thrace, was under siege. Ottoman soldiers fought with desperation, often using bayonets when ammunition ran out. A Bulgarian general wrote in his diary, "They fought like men who knew God had abandoned them." When Edirne finally fell, the shock in Istanbul was unbearable. Crowds gathered outside the mosques, praying, weeping, shouting for revenge. But deep down, everyone knew. The empire's heart had stopped beating. In a smoky London pub, a retired British spy told a journalist something extraordinary. The Balkan Wars weren't just a regional fight. They were a rehearsal, a dress rehearsal for the Great War to come. He slid across the table a single photograph. Ottoman, Serbian, Bulgarian officers all shaking hands before the war. No one could explain it. By the end of 1913, the Ottoman Empire had lost nearly all its European territories: Macedonia, Albania, Kosovo, and most of Thrace. 6 centuries of rule collapsed in less than a year. Enver Pasha stood on the balcony of the War Ministry, watching refugees flood the city gates. "We will rebuild," he said quietly, but his voice trembled, as if even he didn't believe it. Somewhere in the distance, the call to prayer echoed, not as a song of faith, but as a requiem. Spring, 1913. Constantinople was unrecognizable. The streets were flooded with refugees, women clutching children, soldiers limping home, priests whispering prayers for the dead. Markets were empty, mosques filled with silence, and the once glorious Topkapi Palace stood like a monument to loss. Everywhere, people whispered the same question: how did the empire of sultans fall so fast? But no one had an answer, at least not one they dared to speak aloud. Because beneath the ruins, a new power was rising. While the sultans sat in ceremonial silence, the real power had shifted to a secret political faction, the Committee of Union and Progress, led by Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Jamal Pasha. They had started as revolutionaries. Now, they ruled like shadows. Their headquarters in Istanbul looked like an ordinary government building, but inside, the walls were lined with coded maps, European telegraphs, and dossiers marked "confidential" for Enver's eyes only. Their goal? To rebuild the empire, but not as a multicultural Islamic power. They wanted a Turkish nationalist state, purged of weakness, foreign influence, and dissent. But to rebuild, they needed allies, and their eyes turned west, toward Germany. In late 1913, a German diplomat named Hans von Wangenheim arrived in Istanbul. He was no ordinary ambassador. He was the Kaiser's personal envoy, tasked with forging a secret alliance that would change the course of world history. Von Wangenheim met Enver Pasha in a private garden overlooking the Bosphorus. "Your empire bleeds," the German said softly, "but every wound is an opening. Together we can make the world bleed with you." Enver smiled faintly. "And what does Berlin want in return?" "Loyalty," said the German, "and your railroads." It was the birth of a secret pact, one that would soon draw the dying Ottoman Empire into the inferno of World War I. Before the alliance could be sealed, the empire nearly imploded again. In January 1913, as snow blanketed the city, soldiers loyal to the Young Turks stormed the Sublime Porte, the Ottoman government headquarters. They executed ministers, forced the Grand Vizier to resign, and installed Enver Pasha's faction as the new rulers. The event became known as the coup at the Sublime Porte, a bloody turning point almost erased from mainstream history. Witnesses later claimed that when the shooting stopped, one of the dead ministers still clutched a telegram that read, "Urgent. Do not sign the German pact. It will end the empire forever." He was right, but he died before anyone could listen. By mid-1913, Constantinople had become a city of whispers. British, Russian, and German agents flooded the streets, posing as merchants, journalists, and priests. Cafes near Galata Tower buzzed with coded conversations. In one, an aging Ottoman officer met with an unknown European woman known only by her alias, the widow of Sofia. She was rumored to be a triple agent, part spy, part assassin, part myth. She handed him a sealed envelope and whispered, "This isn't over. The Balkans were just the rehearsal." The envelope contained a map, not of the Balkans, but of Europe, with red lines connecting Berlin, Vienna, and Constantinople. At the bottom, one phrase was scrawled in French, "La guerre approche." The war is coming. Rumors began spreading that Ibrahim Haji Demir, the missing Ottoman intelligence officer, was still alive, living somewhere in Vienna under a false name. British records later hinted that he had been working with the French, leaking details of the Ottoman-German negotiations. A single letter, attributed to him, was found decades later in an Austrian archive. They think they are building a new empire. What they are really building is a grave, not only for themselves, but for half the world. If genuine, it was one of the first written warnings of the coming global war. On August 2, 1914, just days after Austria declared war on Serbia, the Ottoman leadership signed a secret treaty with Germany. In a small, candlelit room inside the German embassy, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Ambassador von Wangenheim placed their signatures on parchment. Outside, the city was silent, unaware that its fate had just been sealed. The document pledged Ottoman military cooperation in the event of a European war. In return, Germany promised modern weapons, money, and political support. It was not just an alliance, it was a deal with destiny. Their arrival would soon trigger Britain's fury and drag the Ottoman Empire into World War I. On the night the ships arrived, Enver Pasha looked out at the Bosphorus and said to Talat, confident, "This time we will not lose." Talat said nothing. He only stared at the dark water and whispered, "No empire believes it will, until it does." Autumn, 1914. Europe was already ablaze. The Great War, what the world would later call World War I, had erupted after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Enver Pasha saw an opportunity in the chaos. Germany had promised him glory, the chance to reclaim lost Ottoman lands and restore the empire's honor. But history rarely rewards pride. On October 29, 1914, without even consulting the Sultan, Ottoman warships, the Goeben and Breslau, now renamed Yavuz Sultan Selim and Midilli, attacked Russian ports on the Black Sea. The die was cast. The Ottoman Empire was now officially at war with Britain, France, and Russia, the greatest powers on earth. The Sultan declared a jihad, a holy war, against the Allies. Mosques across the empire echoed with sermons calling Muslims from Africa to India to rise. But the echo was hollow. Few answered. The call came from faith, but the war came from politics. Spring, 1915. The Allies launched a massive invasion at Gallipoli, aiming to seize the Dardanelles Strait and capture Constantinople. It was a desperate gamble and a slaughterhouse. Under Enver Pasha's orders, a young commander named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, took charge of the Ottoman defense. He was calm, precise, ruthless, and he would soon become the empire's last great soldier. When his troops began to retreat, he stood before them and said, firmly, "I do not order you to fight. I order you to die." Determined, in the time it takes for us to die, new forces will come and take our place. They obeyed. For 9 brutal months, the cliffs of Gallipoli ran red with blood. Turkish, British, Australian, New Zealander, French. Flies swarmed over the dead. The smell of death clung to the sea breeze. When the Allies finally withdrew in defeat, the Ottomans celebrated. Gallipoli was a victory, but a Pyrrhic one. The empire had won a battle, and doomed itself to win no more. While the world focused on Gallipoli, another horror was unfolding far to the east. In 1915, fearing internal rebellion and Russian collusion, the Ottoman government ordered the deportation of its Armenian population from Anatolia. What began as a relocation became one of the darkest episodes in modern history. Caravans of men, women, and children were marched across deserts with little food or water. Entire villages vanished. Eyewitnesses described soldiers looting, killing, and burning. German officers, allies of the Ottomans, wrote in secret reports, "Somberly, we are witnessing the destruction of a people." The exact number will forever be debated, but over 1 million souls may have perished. Even within the empire, whispers of guilt spread. Talat Pasha justified it as wartime necessity. Samal Pasha called it a national purification. But Enver said nothing. He simply stared out at the horizon and murmured, gravelly, "Empires do not survive by mercy." History would remember those words and curse them. By 1916, the Ottoman front stretched from the Caucasus to Arabia, from Mesopotamia to Sinai. But the empire was fighting ghosts. Arab tribes, long oppressed under Ottoman rule, now rebelled with British support. A British officer, T.E. Lawrence, later known as Lawrence of Arabia, rode through the desert, uniting the tribes with gold, guns, and promises of independence. In Damascus, Ottoman generals scoffed. "Zeus, Bedouins cannot defeat an empire," they said. But by 1917, the empire was losing not only battles, but its soul. Cities that had once glowed with Islamic glory, Baghdad, Jerusalem, Mecca, fell one by one. The crescent was retreating under the shadow of the cross. Behind the scenes, Britain and France had already divided the Middle East in secret through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a line drawn across a map, cutting through lands they didn't yet own. When the Ottomans finally fell, the victors would claim liberation, but it was really partition. The empire's collapse was not just military, it was engineered. The Allies promised freedom to Arabs, protection to Armenians, and reform to Turks. They delivered none. 1918, the end of the war. Germany was collapsing. Constantinople was starving. One night, Enver, Talat, and Samal met in secret for the last time. They had ruled an empire, commanded millions, and now stood surrounded by ruin. "Quietly, history will judge us," Talat said quietly. "History?" Enver laughs bitterly. "History will forget us." The next morning they fled, in German submarines carrying false passports and stolen gold. But fate followed. Samal was assassinated in Tbilisi. Talat was shot in Berlin by an Armenian survivor. Enver died in the mountains of Central Asia, cut down by the very rebels he once inspired. The empire they built with pride buried them in shame. In 1922, Sultan Mehmed VI watched from his palace window as Allied troops patrolled his city. He was the last Ottoman ruler, a man born to command the world, now waiting for a ship to take him into exile. As he boarded the British warship Malaya, he turned back one last time and said to an officer, thoughtful, "Tell the world, the caliphate is no more." And just like that, after 6 centuries of power, the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. From the ruins, a new figure emerged, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. The soldier who defended Gallipoli now rose to build a nation from ashes. He abolished the Sultanate, severed the chains of the past, and created the Republic of Turkey. The Empire of Faith became a Republic of Reason. The crescent still flew, but under a new sky. Even today, in the narrow alleys of Istanbul, the past still whispers. Old mosques echo with ghosts. Palaces hold secrets in their stones. The Ottoman Empire may have died, but its shadow shaped the modern world. It redrew the Middle East, sparked World War I, and left wounds that still bleed a century later. Ibrahim Haji Damir, if he truly lived to see it, once wrote, "Thoughtful, empires never fall in a single moment. They fall in hearts, long before the final gun is fired." When the Ottoman Empire officially ended in 1922, the world cheered. Europe thought it had finally erased the sick man. But empires never truly vanish. They dissolve into memory, culture, and consequence. The Ottoman collapse didn't just redraw borders. It rewired the modern world. Look closely, and you'll see its fingerprints everywhere. In the Middle East, where the artificial borders of Sykes-Picot still fuel wars. In the Balkans, where old Ottoman rivalries ignite every generation. In Europe, where the refugee trails follow the same paths Ottoman caravans once took. Even the modern concept of secular nationalism in the Muslim world, from Turkey to Egypt, was born as a reaction to the empire's fall. But few realize, the Ottomans were not simply a dying power. They were the hinge of civilization, a bridge between East and West, faith and reason, tradition and modernity. When they fell, that bridge shattered, and the world has been trying to rebuild it ever since. For decades after the fall, Allied historians painted the Ottomans as backward despots, relics of a medieval age. But newly opened archives tell a more complex story. Documents uncovered in Istanbul's Yildiz Palace reveal something shocking. In 1913, the Ottoman Ministry of Science had secretly begun developing wireless communication technology, years before it reached the Arab world. In 1916, Ottoman physicians in Istanbul had established an anti-plague vaccine institute, inspired by European medical journals. And in 1917, a report titled Project Crescent outlined plans to modernize the empire's education system using American teaching models. History rarely mentions these, because empires aren't just defeated by guns, they're defeated by narratives. The Ottoman story was rewritten to justify colonial rule. The barbaric East had to be destroyed, so the civilized West could save it. Few Americans realize this. During the final decades of the Ottoman Empire, hundreds of American missionaries and educators were active across Anatolia and the Levant. They built schools, hospitals, and universities, many of which still exist today. Robert College, now Boğaziçi University, in Istanbul. American University of Beirut. American College of Sofia. Near East Relief, which later became the largest humanitarian mission in U.S. history. When the Armenian genocide began, it was these American workers who smuggled survivors out, wrote secret letters, and documented the truth the world ignored. In 1918, one American nurse wrote in her diary, "Sad, empires fall, but the children remain. Thoughtful, we will build something new upon their tears." That single line inspired the founding of Near East Foundation, which still operates to this day. So in a strange twist, while the Ottoman Empire fell, America inherited its humanitarian mission. The torch passed quietly, from Istanbul to Washington. Travelers in the Balkans, the Middle East, and Anatolia still stumble upon strange ruins. Crumbling fountains, Arabic calligraphy carved into marble, or ancient caravansaries lost in silence. But historians discovered something remarkable. Many Ottoman buildings were deliberately erased after 1923. Entire archives were burned, mosques were converted, names were changed. Why? Because Turkey was reborn under Ataturk's secular revolution, and he wanted to build a new identity, free from the past. Yet, every empire leaves echoes. A researcher in 2019 found an unmarked grave near Gallipoli. Inside was a rusted medallion, inscribed in Ottoman Turkish, "To die for faith is to live forever." But beside it someone had carved in Latin letters much later, and yet we forgot. That anonymous inscription, two scripts, two eras, captured the empire's soul, faith and forgetting, side by side. The Ottoman legacy didn't just vanish, it mutated into myth. The fear of a rising East in Europe traces back to centuries of Ottoman expansion. The romance of the Orient, turbans, bazaars, harems, was Western imagination of a fallen empire. The modern intelligence network, MI6, OSS, later CIA, took lessons from Ottoman spy systems that had once stretched from Vienna to Yemen. And perhaps the most ironic truth of all, the very nations that destroyed the Ottoman Empire inherited its geopolitical problems and still struggle with them today. The Balkans, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, all once ruled under the Ottoman crescent, all now fractured under flags drawn by European hands. As a British diplomat wrote in 1920, "We killed the empire, but not its question." In 1944, in a small apartment in Cairo, an old man claiming to be Ibrahim Haji Demir, the same soldier whose journals began this story, died quietly in his sleep. Next to him was a weathered notebook. On its final page he had written, "I was born an Ottoman. I lived through war, loss, and exile. The empire is gone, yet I still see its shadow when I close my eyes." Maybe the empire was never land or gold. Maybe it was the idea that men could be many and still be one. His words were never published, but years later, a historian found them and realized they contained the coordinates of an unmarked grave in modern-day Turkey. The inscription on the stone read, "Here lies the last Ottoman." There's a strange irony in how the Ottoman story ended. Not in Istanbul, but in Washington. In 1924, an Ottoman delegation visited the U.S. Senate, seeking recognition for the new Republic of Turkey. When the senators asked about the empire's crimes, the old diplomat smiled faintly and said, "Empires are like mirrors, gentlemen. When you break one, you only see yourself." The room fell silent, because by then, the world had already entered a new era, of empires cloaked as nations. Today, the Ottoman Empire survives not in territory, but in memory. In the call to prayer echoing over Istanbul's skyline, in the spice markets of Sarajevo, in the melodies of Arab oud and Balkan violin blending in harmony. It survives in the idea of coexistence, however imperfect, the dream that so many empires failed to realize. Maybe that's why the story of the Ottomans still fascinates Americans, because it's not just about the East, it's about power, fall, and rebirth, themes that every civilization eventually faces. As the sun sets over the Bosphorus, the sea glows red like molten gold. Seagulls cry above the domes of Hagia Sophia. And somewhere, in that twilight between faith and history, the ghosts of the Ottomans still march, silent, proud, eternal. For 600 years they ruled 3 continents. For 100 more they've ruled imagination. And as Ibrahim Haji Demir once wrote before vanishing into the pages of time, the empire is gone, but perhaps it only changed its name, from Ottoman to human.